So I've always kind of suspected SoundCloud to be doing some kind of garbage to any kind of songs that I upload to it. Mainly, I've noticed um, lots of changes to the high-end frequencies. The best way I can kind of describe it is kind of smearing of the high frequencies or removing some of the transients in these high frequencies. And so today I just wanted to do some analysis of what both SoundCloud and YouTube are doing to songs and music that I upload. It's kind of interesting what I found. I think people have done this analysis before, and many people know it, and it could be coming down to simply compression artifacts. But I think some of it was quite interesting to me. So what I'm looking at now is the frequency spectrum of three different versions of a song, and I just captured some 10-second loud part of the song in Voxengo. And the preset I'm using here is kind of this low frequency inspection. I also kind of made some changes to the slope just to keep that at 6 dB. That's kind of usually what I use. But the main thing that's kind of interesting is what's happening in this high end. And so I guess this magenta, this color is SoundCloud, the blue is YouTube, and green is the original master. There's a very steep roll off, around 35 hertz. There is also a very steep roll off at 20 kilohertz, and that's just originally in the master. Something to also note is the range that I have in Voxengo. So the range low is going to -100. So it's really looking at very low volume. And the interesting thing here is what SoundCloud is doing. You can see that there's a really steep roll off around 16.5. I think it starts around 16 and just drops down, and you see some junk down here. That's probably from compression. But the YouTube one, it pretty much tracks the original master. There isn't much changes. You just have this change in the low end, but both SoundCloud and YouTube are doing this in the low end. And this is really quiet that you will not, it should not affect anything. You won't hear it, definitely. I suspect this is really what's ruining the high frequencies and any kind of music you upload to SoundCloud. You really notice it if you have some kind of sharp hi-hats. There's basically a lot of sound in this high part of the spectrum. When you upload a song and you play it back, you sort of hear this very strange, like almost like phasing and smearing of these high frequencies. And you might have noticed it. I definitely have noticed it. And what usually kind of fixes it is some roll-offs, high frequencies, just basically not having so much high frequencies. But I think this is, I don't know why SoundCloud is doing this, whereas YouTube isn't. It seems like, YouTube is also doing compression. SoundCloud could do something similar. It doesn't need to chop off this high frequency. There are some forum threads that talk about I think it's the Opus compression is doing this, but it could be some parameters that's being used, because I think YouTube is also using Opus. So what I have here are three waveforms. One of them is from SoundCloud, one of them is from YouTube, and one of them is the original master. And the idea here is I want to do a null test, or at least try to do a null test, and get as close as I can. It's a little bit difficult because you you cannot really get the original files and have them perfectly align with the master. I have to come in and kind of manually align things. But let me just quickly talk about these waveforms. The master is a 48K sample rate, 32-bit float. And this is the master I use to create the video for YouTube as well as upload to SoundCloud. And when I created the video, I kept it as lossless as well in terms of audio. The way that I pulled the YouTube audio is using YouTube Downloader. You can kind of use this to strip out the best quality audio from the video, and you end up with this Opus file. And the Opus has some properties. It's a 48K sample rate, bit rate is 139 kilobits, and this is the encoder. The way to actually get the SoundCloud one is a bit different because you can't actually download the compressed version, because what I want to do is compare the compressed versions with the original. And the way that I had to get this is by using the kind of RME device that I have that has a loopback. And I have to basically send the Windows audio to loopback and then record into Reaper. It's all digital, so I don't expect any kind of artifacts to show up. It seemed to have worked fairly well. The only problem is the alignment. And, for this, I really had to kind of zoom in here and, find some point of reference that I could kind of align these things, like with this little peak here. So it's not perfectly aligned, but it is as close as I could get. Something also just interesting to point out is the bottom is the actual wave, and it begins at this time. And the YouTube version actually has some time before it, some small amount of noise before it, similar with the SoundCloud one. I don't know why that's the case. Maybe it's the compression that causes that. But anyways, I had to line these up. The next thing I had to match is the volume. And this is a little bit difficult also because probably the compression is affecting the volume a little bit. But the easiest way I could figure out is just pick some dB value and make the peak of all of them go to that value. So I think I used minus 0.1 and just make them all peak at minus 0.1. I'm going to quickly play the master, and we're just going to watch on this spectrum what it looks like. And what you really want to do is pay attention to the high end, because that's really my concern in this video is this high end. There's some interesting stuff in the low end, but it's really the high end that's interesting. You can kind of see that, there's a very steep high pass around 40, and there's a very steep low pass around 20 kilohertz. So that's what the original wave file actually had. Now I'm going to play the SoundCloud version, and if you just watch this high end, you'll see that there's kind of a big difference. It does not go to 20 kilohertz, it goes to something less, around 16 kilohertz. again, you see that there's this sharp roll off around 16 kilohertz. There's also some low end showing up. YouTube one also has that, and like I said earlier, I think this is pretty much inaudible, and I don't think it really affects anything. But it is the high end that's I'm kind of concerned about. So the next thing I'll do is a null test with the master. This should let you hear some differences between SoundCloud and YouTube as compared to the master. And what you really want to listen out for is this high end frequencies. You should definitely hear a difference in the SoundCloud difference. There is quite a bit more high end that can be heard than the YouTube one. The YouTube one also has a lot of difference, but for in the SoundCloud one, the high end is really emphasized. So I'm going to switch between SoundCloud and YouTube. The equalizer is not super important here, though you can actually see that the high frequency is changing. I would say more just try to listen for the changes. So first I will flip the phase of the master. We are going to just play the master in either the SoundCloud version or either the YouTube version. So first is the SoundCloud version. I'm going to switch to YouTube. Back to SoundCloud. Back to YouTube. SoundCloud. So to me, the SoundCloud one sounds like shit. The high end in the SoundCloud diff is like you can hear the smearing of the highs, which is it's something I always kind of suspected when I uploaded stuff. It just didn't sound right in the high end frequencies. Now the YouTube diff, there's a lot of diff, but I think it's more even, at least across kind of the full spectrum. You don't have this huge emphasis in the highs being changed. And so I think it's kind of interesting. I don't know what SoundCloud is doing, why they have such a difference. I mean, there's that roll off at 16 kilohertz, which to me doesn't make any sense if YouTube isn't doing it. Why is SoundCloud doing it? No, I think that I don't think that it's just the 16 kilohertz and higher that's kind of ruining the sound, because the 16 kilohertz and high, that's also quite difficult to hear. I think there's a lot more going on in the lower frequencies. It's just quite hard to do this difference and do this analysis. I think the null test really shows it. Just as an example, you can use N-convolution to create some very steep filter curves. And here I'm basically applying a high pass to the master, and I pick 16 kilohertz just to see if I could kind of hear it if I'm only playing those frequencies. So if I hit play, you kind of see these frequencies hear, but you probably can't hear them. Even if I turn the volume up, it's still quite difficult to hear. So I think the roll off at 16 kilohertz may not be the only issue, but there's probably a lot more going on even before that frequency, as you can kind of hear when I do this null test. And again, the null test is not perfect. I had to do some alignment, but is the closest I can get. And I think you can actually hear the big difference in highs. And I think that's I've always noticed that those high frequencies changing whenever I upload it to SoundCloud. Yeah, so there you go. It's just some interesting analysis. Do what you will with it. I don't have any solution to it. I think just maybe kind of rolling off some high frequencies maybe could make things better in SoundCloud. I haven't really done much comparison in terms of what makes the sound quality better. But I really think SoundCloud should be at least up to par with what YouTube is doing. And it definitely is not